I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today we're popping on our headphones, turning up the volume, and jamming out as I rank these Soulsborne games by their soundtracks. More than any other topic, music is subjective. I may love a style of a track that appears in one game that you may dislike. So if you find yourself disagreeing with my opinions, that's okay, valid, and normal. Hell, scripting this video, I went back and forth on placements for a good 2 hours until I settled on an order I was satisfied with, and even then, if I'd sat there for another 2 hours, it would have changed. Feel free to share your favorite OSTs and tracks from each game down below. My aim in this video is to highlight the soundtrack as a whole. One good track can only carry a game so far. Do I remember the music when I'm not playing the game or editing a video with the music in the background? That's the question. So without further ado, all 7 Soulsborne soundtracks ranked. Let's begin with... Taking the bottom spot on our list, we have the Demon Souls OST, originally composed by Shunsuke Kida, with Bill Hempsterpat arranging and composing the soundtrack for the 2020 remake. Immediately, the reasoning behind this low placement should be obvious. We have 2 soundtracks for the same game that take a completely different tone to the source material. Kida's experimental works held the original Demon Souls in a very subdued yet intriguing light. Maiden in Black uses pauses throughout the music to build atmosphere in a way that feels really comforting to the player. King Alant's battle theme gives you that Castlevania Dracula vibe with the organ, and yet I also draw parallels to Shadow of the Colossus in its arrangement. Maiden Estrella is perhaps the most well-known track from the game, with its haunting, heartbreaking melody that ironically feels less like her boss music and more like your boss music. The Tower Knights theme in Kida's soundtrack is iconic for the meme, that chorus of laughter in the background, yet it still somehow sounds intimidating. Meanwhile, Hempsterpat's remake soundtrack goes all in on those epic scores that we've come to expect from current FromSoftware titles. There's nothing inherently wrong with any tracks. I think the Fool's Idol and the Storm King OSTs go extremely hard, sounding far better than their counterparts. Same with the Dirty Colossus and the Adjudicator, whose original tracks were iconic for all the wrong reasons. Where this OST falls short is that the highs are often high, but the lows are really low. The aforementioned Dirty Colossus OST from Kida's soundtrack is just unpleasant for me to listen to. The Penetrator not getting an official theme until the remake, and said theme not really landing with me, if I'm honest, didn't help. My issue with the remake's OST is that some of the tracks are too epic and grandiose for the actual in-game fight they're attached to. Leechmonger, Adjudicator, they get these surprisingly well-developed epic tracks, but you'll barely hear them in-game before the fight's over and we move on. I think the subdued nature of the original OST works better with what Demon Souls is trying to be, but I don't think they truly nailed that style of soundtrack until Dark Souls a few years later. While some of my favorite themes in the series do come from Demon Souls, the overall package is a hard to fully recommend jumble that doesn't have a coherent through line between both OSTs. Neither is better than the other, that's still personal preference, but for me, they just aren't memorable enough soundtracks to topple any of the other games on today's list. Next up, I'm so sorry to the Sekiro fans, but it ranks at my number 6. I swear, I love Sekiro. I don't hate it even though everyone thinks I do. But I've got to admit, when it comes to Sekiro's OST, I can't recall more than a handful of tracks off the top of my head. Composed by the legendary Yuka Kitamura, Sekiro's soundtrack is steeped in Japanese culture. I'm not nearly knowledgeable enough to tell you what instruments they used, but there's a lot of string, a lot of woodwind sounds, which for me are pure ear candy. We've got epic, bombastic boss music like the Corrupted Monk, which builds in each phase on the same melody, getting better every time, and the way the strings pull in the background like nails on a chalkboard, but in a good way, is so amazing. Genichiro's theme immediately gives this intense feeling of 2 warriors dueling it out, ingrained in my mind from the amount of times I had to reattempt that fight. It ditches a lot of the wind instruments for a grander scale, a drumming beat in the background that gets you hyped for the fight ahead. Or on the other side of the scale, what about Apparitions, which plays when you fight the Headless and the Shichimen warriors? This genuinely harrowing, haunting track with the low, ominous choir in the background that makes you feel like you've fallen into the underworld, with the track building up to this edge that never comes. Oh, it's like tension coiled into a spring. Great Shinobi Owl, which is able to show the genuine malice of Owl's character and the duplicity of his actions. Emma the Gentle Blade's tragic yet beautiful theme that showcases her character alongside her absolutely amazing boss fight. And yet the main reason with the Sekiro soundtrack and why it ranks so low is that the overall sound is too similar. I find myself confusing certain tracks with others, sometimes I'll completely misremember tunes. In the moment, each theme is stunning, but when I haven't played the game for a few months, I don't remember many of the tracks. I do think more than any other game in the series though, Sekiro's soundtrack is enhanced by its ambiance. Unlike the FromSoftware games prior to Sekiro's release, you're always accompanied by dynamic music, sneaking around different areas, shifting to a tone of fervor once spotted, and if you turn the music off in the menu, the sound design of Sekiro is insane. It's not what I'm here to judge, I just wanted to shout it out. Taking the number 5 spot, we have Dark Souls 2, composed by Motoi Sakuraba and Yuka Kitamura. But I want to stress, if there's one thing that this game needs to be proud of, it is its soundtrack. Because while I do think Dark Souls 2 suffers from the same issue as Sekiro in that many of the boss OSTs blend together and are hard to recall when I'm not playing the game, that makes the tracks I do remember that much more memorable. It doesn't help that this game has 41 bosses including the DLC, so obviously some tracks were bound to get lost in the shuffle. Speaking of, the DLCs are where this soundtrack brought it the most. Burnt Ivory King is this call to war that builds up as you fight your way through the charred Lois Knights. It feels like the type of music I'd hear fighting Sauron from Lord of the Rings. The chorus choir is fucking insane, and the grandiose instruments giving away to that quiet moment of reflection before the music comes back in full force. Sir Alon is another fight with one of the most iconic opening few moments. That choir that leads into a battle against two skilled warriors, it feels like you're truly facing someone of your skill level, and the theme never backs down. I can tell this is a Yuka Kitamura composition because it feels right at home in Dark Souls 3 and made the DLC worth the purchase for Dark Souls 2. But the base game hits it out of the park too. The Ruined Sentinels theme, which doubles as the battle music for the Smelter Demon, has always been a personal favourite of mine thanks to the brass instruments. But easily the best boss theme, hot take alert, it goes to the Ancient Dragon. Go and listen to the final boss themes of the first two Golden Sun games, and then come back to listen to the Ancient Dragon. Motoi Sakuraba is back up to his old tricks, fucking with the music in terms of the timing, the tempo, and everything else, keeping you on your toes the entire time. Sucks it's set to one of the worst fights in the game. Executioner's Chariot, Nashandra, Aldia, Sin, the end credits theme, and yet the best track in the game is the bloody hub. If I was simply ranking the games based on their best themes, Majula would have boosted Dark Souls 2 into the top 3 alone. It may genuinely be one of my favourite pieces of music to listen to from gaming, period, and you can bet your ass that when I do a top 10 themes from the Soulsborne series, Majula will be there. Such a serene track. The twinkle of the instruments, the light beat behind certain notes, the eeriness, and yet safety as the strings kick in. All set to the gorgeous town of Majula and those beautiful golden yellows, the crash of the waves on the cliffs, the wind in your ear. Dark Souls 2 has such hidden gems in the soundtrack, and you can bet that when I get around to doing that individual theme rankings, Dark Souls 2 will be showing up to the big boys table, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. But as an overall fully cohesive soundtrack, it needs to trim the fat. It's just too big for the scope of the game, and many of these tracks fall into a sense of padding when they're used for those types of boss fights, which is a real shame. Hey viewers, a brief moment of your time. It's February, I'm officially moved to my new home, but the journey for 20,000 subscribers before summer of 2024 doesn't stop here. Take a look at how many of you aren't subscribed, kinda crazy, right? So be sure, if you enjoy the rest of this video, to parry that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all my future rankings and videos. Back to the list. Taking today's middle spot, we have number 4, Bloodborne, composed by Yuka Kitomura, Tsukasa Saito, Chris Velasco, Ryan Amon, Nobuyoshi Suzuki, and Michael Wandmacher. A pretty beefy team that created some spectacular tracks to listen to. Bloodborne, like Sekiro, focuses on a very specific genre and style of music, fitting into this gothic Victorian aesthetic before slowly easing its way into the unknown as you face more of those extraterrestrial bosses. Now we're entering the territory of soundtracks where I can vividly recall many of the themes off the top of my head without needing to play the game or listen to them on YouTube. Bloodborne's soundtrack is elevated on the PlayStation via the use of a live choir and orchestra, and for 2015, that was pretty insane. I recall watching studio footage of the orchestra performing the Cleric Beast soundtrack and being absolutely blown away by how stunning it was. More than any of the other games in the series, Bloodborne's highs are as high as you can get. The Hunter by Ryan Amon, where Gascoigne's theme ramps up in difficulty across his 3 states, devolving into madness as he succumbs to his beasthood, is fantastic. Lullaby for Murgo being this chilling music box track that sticks to its gimmick and is all the better for it. And his Hail the Nightmare Hypogean Jail theme with that haunting choir could make even the hardest player feel uneasy. But when it comes to boss themes in Bloodborne, nobody does it better than Tsukasa Saito. Cleric Beast and Bloodstarved Beast are amazing, but imagine getting to compose the first Hunter, Gehrman's theme, which is one of the most beloved from the series, with that tragic melody as 2 hunters fight each other, one to free the other from the dream, the other like a puppet on a string. Or how about his work with the Orphan of Kos, the first phase being so haunting and cold despite the shrieks of the boss, before his enraged state ramps up the music with the strings as suddenly you're the prey and the orphan is ready to tango. But his best theme is Lawrence the First Vicar, one of the most blasphemous sounding tracks I've ever heard. The First Vicar succumbed to the scourge of the beasts, a flaming cleric beast, as the church music plays in the background, the choir chanting, the organ, and then that brief moment of beauty with the strings midway through before the choir kicks back in. And how have I not mentioned Nobuyoshi Suzuki's Ludwig the Holy Blade, which is lauded as some of the best music in the series? The Phase 1 to Phase 2 soundtrack that denotes Ludwig's changing mental state is one of the best I've heard in years. Ultimately though, while I adore a majority of the tracks I just mentioned, and I see the argument for Bloodborne having the best OST in the series, I'm just not a big fan of some of the other main boss tracks. Ironically, those by Yuka Kitamura. The Watchers for the Shadows of Yharnam and Rom the Vacuous Spider fall very flat to me, and dare I say it, I'm not as head over heels for Lady Maria's theme than most of the gaming populace. I can't even remember it off the top of my own head. Bloodborne is forever my favourite Souls game, but I just connect with other OSTs more, and I think I'm learning I prefer that traditional fantasy theme over the more gothic Bloodborne tracks, and you know what? That's okay. Coming in at number 3, we have the original Dark Souls, composed by Motoi Sakuraba. The first Dark Souls is my comfort game, and more than any other game in the series, I remember almost every track on this OST. Dark Sun Gwyndolin's haunting melody, which is also used by the Moonlight Butterfly to great effect, with that haunting vocal in the background. Great Grey Wolf Sif's tragic duet between 2 different singers while you're trying to wipe the tears away from your eyes. Pinwheel's dark and disturbing theme, one of the best opening 10 seconds of any track. It's so striking and sets a tone that I wish could have belonged to a fight with better balance. Gwyn's Plin Plon Plin, the most iconic of the final boss themes in the series. Whether it's the best or not, I'll rank that another day, but without a doubt that somber, melancholic tone permeates throughout. And of course, ONS's theme, which also acts as an introduction to Anor Londo and feels the most like a Motoi Sakuraba theme of the whole soundtrack. I just love that my man, who did one of the best JRPG soundtracks of all time with the Golden Sun series, decided to flex for Dark Souls and knocked it out of the park. Firelink Shrine is one of the most relaxing themes in the series, yet there's always a sense that you're not fully safe even at your resting point. And even the DLC, while not my favourite tracks from the game, have bangers like Night Artorias, which is a surprisingly low-key track for most of the fight as you tackle the Abyss Walker as best you can. Or how about the Comedy of Ash Lake, and how you can stop and start the music as you enter by looking up at the skybox and back down again. I'll never get bored of doing that. I even own the OST on CD through the official Dark Souls art book, and yet it's only taking the bronze medal. ¿Por qué? The answer's pretty simple, it's pure personal taste. I adore so many of these themes, and yet I just prefer the themes from my top 2 picks that much more. If I had to critique, this is very nitpicky, I could say I'm not the biggest fan of some of the lesser themes on the soundtrack. Gaping Dragon, Centipede Demon, Nito, Seath. They have decent music, but it's not quite my cup of tea. Something I've noticed about my top 2 picks is that pretty much every major boss, aka the ones you think about the most, have memorable and iconic OSTs, and I don't think Dark Souls fully made it to that point. That's it. That's all it takes to knock something down a placement in my rankings. Still has the best end credits theme with Nameless Song though. It's been 2 years now, recency bias is dead, I can safely say that Elden Ring actually has one of my favourite soundtracks in the series, and comfortably takes my number 2 spot. Composed by Shoei Miyazawa, Yuka Kitamura, Tsukasa Saito, Yoshimi Kudo, and Tai Tomisawa, every single one of these composers put their composer-ussies into this game. Miyazawa hits us with some of the best tracks, Moog, Lord of Blood, with one of the catchiest chorus themes in the game. It's got the blasphemous operatic chanting combined with gorgeous music that rises and falls with the fight itself. And yet when you reach the apex, it goes insane with the chanting and the bombastic vocals as you near the fight's finale. Starscourge Radahn, which, come on, need I explain? 2 very distinct phases, the first with the music toying with you, sounding similar to what you may have already heard in the game, but then phase 2 hits, Radahn crashes down like a meteor, and his true boss theme hits and you're faced with such an ominous, intense storm of instruments, horns, the works. Oh, and Miyazawa did the Godric OST, which is widely considered to be one of the best themes of the game thanks to that amazing shift to phase 2. Kitamura, meanwhile, was trusted with the more haunting tracks this time around. Renala of the Full Moon, Regal Ancestor Spirit, both dripping with beauty and grace. She even got to compose the Rea Lucaria theme, which has been stuck in my head longer than I care to admit. But her best track is, of course, Malenia Blade of Miquella. The first phase is so spiritual, so calm, like dancing on the water. While her second phase is this explosion as Malenia's composure cracks and she nukes you with rot because she's a sore loser, Asia O'Haraing those butterflies across the arena as the vocals build up in the background. Saito hits us with the Margit and Morgott themes, which makes complete sense, but he's also responsible for the most iconic track in the game, the fucking opening, which returns for the final battle. I almost feel bad that no matter where this man goes now, this will be the track that cements his legacy. The Elden Ring main theme has transcended the rest of the game, and it deserves its spot as one of the greats. Yoshimi Kudo hits us with 2 tracks I adore, the God-Devouring Serpent, which continues that epic religious blasphemous theme we've been seeing throughout this video, and Lich Dragon Fortisax, which delves into the same tones, but this time with a gothic explosive theme, the organ absolutely shredding throughout with the vocals in the background. And last but not least, Tai Tomisawa, who has two of my favourite tracks in Elden Ring, Dragon Lord Placidusax, a perfect 3-stage theme that builds and builds alongside the dynamic nature of the battle, and the Godskin theme, which has no right to be as epic and entertaining as it ended up being, and for me is the standout of all the new Elden Ring tracks bar none. I genuinely think with a few more years, Elden Ring may overtake my #1 game, but I do think with how many of the tracks are reused across the board, it does cheapen them after your 10th time hearing it. An absolute grand effort, and I love that it also incorporates the Sekiro dynamic music as you explore the world. Brilliant effort, love that. But I just can't deny my #1. Taking the gold medal today, we have Dark Souls 3, composed by Yuka Kitamura and Motoi Sakuraba, with Tsukasa Saito and Nobuyoshi Suzuki popping in to compose Iudex Gundyr and Deacons of the Deep respectively. Both fantastic tracks, might I add. Iudex sets the tone and is able to blend seamlessly with Kitamura's sense of taste, to the point that I was surprised this was composed by a different composer. And Deacons of the Deep, once again, I've said it so many times this video, you may as well take a shot every time. Blasphemous as fuck. Kitamura handles most of the heavy lifting with this OST, with my man Motoi Sakuraba handling a handful of boss themes throughout the main game. His work on the Crystal Sages OST is very reminiscent to me of his Pinwheel track from Dark Souls, which makes sense as this boss feels like it was attempting to redeem Pinwheel by designing a similar fight. Very low, threatening, almost off-key sounding notes that work beautifully in context. Of course, he handles Aldrich, Devourer of Gods, which is itself a rearrangement of Gwendolyn's theme from Dark Souls, which Sakuraba also composed. It's actually my favourite version of this track, more epic, befitting of the Devourer of Gods, who had to devour said god's OST into his own theme, a thief to the bitter end. He also handles the old Demon King, which makes sense, as it was also a callback to Dark Souls and Demonkind, the drums, the frantic pace, the female vocals calling back to the Bed of Chaos. His best work for me though is the Nameless King. Motoi Sakuraba is just hardwired to absolutely slay every single composition that involves a dragon boss. From Golden Sun to Dark Souls, he nails it every time. The first phase features all of his usual trademarks, while the second phase slows down while keeping the intensity, allowing the king to shine as a boss, remaining threatening. And in certain parts of the OST, you can even hear the classic Plin Plon Plin in Phase 2, alluding to the Nameless King's true identity as Gwyn's firstborn. Also, I lied, his best work may be the Nameless King, but my favourite track that Motoi worked on is Vort of the Boreal Valley, another theme that has transcended Dark Souls 3 to become the meme music for content creators everywhere. That enraged state transition is gold, and the whole theme itself is an absolutely deserving bop. But Yuka Kitamura is the true shining star of this soundtrack. I can't go over every music piece individually, but some of her best include the Dancer of the Boreal Valley, whose track works at a different timing to the rest of the OST alongside the boss's movements, which gives this surreal feel. I do apologize, I'm not gifted in music theory, so I can't explain the logistics behind why the Dancer's theme works so well, but there are countless YouTube videos out there if you want to go check those out. She did all the DLCs, such as Slave Knight Gale and Sister Freed, which absolutely slay and are some of the best tracks she's composed, but my personal favourites are actually the Twin Princes, the Abyss Watchers, and Soul of Cinder. Sue me, I have a big appreciation for the Dark Souls 3 base game track. Twin Princes is already such a good song in Phase 1 that only gets more melancholic and dramatic as Phase 2 hits, and the string instruments as you hit that main chorus just, ooh, it's so good. It does things to me I can't even begin to describe. Abyss Watchers, with the bell tolling in the background, and the female vocalist has this tragic atmosphere I've come to adore throughout this list. I actually think the Phase 1 is better than the Phase 2, the subdued nature of the track working in its favour when surrounded by the corpses of the Undead Legion. Phase 2 is still fun, but I find with Kitamura's work, I always preferred the build-up to the payoff. And lastly, Soul of Cinder. I mean, Phase 1 is already iconic, starting with the male vocals in the background, a real battle happening as the brass instruments announce this final fight with severity. It's so fun, so intense, it works perfectly. But that transition to phase 2 as the music builds up to a crescendo and then, incorporating the new boss theme as well as Gwyn's original theme as the moveset shifts is the best moment in the game. Plin Plon Plin hits so much harder when you're finally getting to fight a strong variation of Gwyn, and it felt like such a climactic end to the series that the callback felt earned. The only thing I wish was that there was also a nod to Dark Souls 2 in the final boss theme as well, just to bring the trilogy together more. But ultimately, it doesn't matter. Dark Souls 3 for me has the most memorable tracks, and I absolutely adore them all. Is it the obvious choice? Could there be bias? Almost certainly, this is a subjective topic, but I find that Dark Souls 3's tracks are all rooted in very strong memories for me, and that only enhances my relationship with the music. When I can associate specific notes with moments in my life, I think that's a pretty magical thing, isn't it? And that's my list. How much do you disagree with me? Let me know down below, and be sure to parry that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of my future videos. And consider joining the channel as a member. You'll get early access to specific videos and a shout out in the descriptions and at the end of my videos. Speaking of, my socials are on screen now. Feel free to follow where you feel comfortable. I'd recommend my Twitter, my Blue Sky, or my Discord, whatever floats your boat. Twitter is probably your best bet though, or you can check out my YouTube community tab. I post there often. Obviously, a massive shout out to my YouTube channel members. You guys are amazing for supporting me for another month. And a shout out to my patrons over on Patreon. I am going to be phasing away from Patreon to YouTube at some point soon, but I just want to thank you all so much for your support. I'll see you guys next time with another video. Adios.